Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Chem webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. Thank you so much for joining us. So the title of today's webinar is Using InCAS at YK Power School, and you'll see that I'm joined today by the absolutely fantastic and lovely Siobhan, who is Primary Principal and Head of Wudang Campus at YK Power. So before we get started, I'm just going to cover a couple of housekeeping points. You are all in listen-only mode, so if you do have any questions, please just post these in the questions section, and this is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Questions and also comments are welcome throughout the entire presentation, and we will answer these at the end of the webinar. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for this webinar by email. This will be sent straight through to your inbox by email 1 hour after the webinar finishes. And lastly, if you do have any technical difficulties with either sound or audio, please just let me know, either by sending a message into the question section or sending me a quick email. Siobhan and I are both hosting this completely remotely, so do bear with us if there are any technical issues, but I'm crossing my fingers that everything will be fine. I'm just going to turn my camera off now so I can talk you through the agenda. So we've got a packed agenda for our webinar today. Before we dive into the presentation, myself and Siobhan will introduce ourselves. This will then be followed by a presentation into how chem assessments can help educators like you unlock student potential in schools around the world. Siobhan will then give you an overview of YK Power School and how they use our InCAS assessment for students aged 5 to 11. This will then be followed by a discussion between myself and Siobhan, delving into the areas that you will find useful and the real benefits to schools in regards to sharing information, InCAS information and reports with parents. There's lots of exciting things coming up. So before we get started, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Kate McKim. I'm your webinar presenter today. I work in the marketing team and I joined Chem almost 2 years ago now. And then before I dive into the presentation, I'm going to hand over to Siobhan to introduce herself as well.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. Well, I'm going to say good afternoon from Shanghai because I'm in Shanghai in China. My name is Siobhan Alam, and I'm the primary principal here at YK Power School in Shanghai, China. I've been in Shanghai since 2018, and prior to that, I was out at St. Paul's School in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Really looking forward to chatting and talking a little bit more in detail later on in the webinar.
Thank you, Siobhan. Yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing that from you. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of Chem and our assessments. So Chem have been part of the Cambridge family since 2019, and we were acquired by Cambridge University Press and Assessment. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and our mission is really to unlock every student's potential with the very best research-based assessment and learning solutions. We have the same aims as you do in your schools, and that is to support all learners to reach their full potential. We work with schools in over 109 countries, and the quality of our assessments is widely recognised both in the UK and globally. And for us, bringing Chem into the Cambridge family has been a hugely exciting opportunity to support more educators like you worldwide in improving educational outcomes. So this is a question that comes up. So what do you need to differentiate teaching and learning? And there's so many things that contribute to this. So for educators, you have to differentiate your practice for students in the classroom. In a lot of cases, you'll be gathering data and information from here, there, and everywhere, from subject to class to individual student to teacher-generated information. There is a lot of information available in schools. And in a lot of cases, you'll use your professional judgment and observations. And either that or you have to wait, especially at the start of school when you have new students coming into your classroom and you don't know what their underlying abilities and potential is. Those students will be coming in with either little or no information or data, or potentially with some inconsistent information from their feeder schools, or just information that you don't necessarily believe. And it takes time. It takes time getting to know your students at that very start of the year. You'll spend all your time doing that because you can optimize the learning experience for each student, their outcomes and grades. They will improve. You'll engage the students more effectively if you are differentiating their learning. You'll be able to advise them and their parents with confidence because you have the independent and objective information to support your judgment. So how can Chem's assessments really help you? So we all know, and I think we all probably can agree that, and every teacher out there would agree, that there are a lot of different variables that contribute to the success of a student. You know, the final grade a student gets in their examinations, there'll be lots of factors that feed into it. Now, the one in purple, subject knowledge, is the one that most people tend to focus on because it is a really important part. But just knowing your subject and having that knowledge about the subject doesn't guarantee that final examination grade. You know, there's everything else between there, from the start of the journey to the end of the journey, has an impact. Their preferred learning style, their background they've got at home, what support they're going to get from their families and parents, their engagement in the classroom, whether they have any special educational needs, and also their language ability. You know, what's that language ability like? What are you going to do to support that language ability? So the one in gold is the one that Chem focuses on, and that is cognitive ability. So assessments that assess cognitive ability really underpin and look into a student's thinking and reasoning abilities. And these range from verbal and mathematical abilities to problem solving. And understanding a student's general cognitive ability in this mix, knowing that all of these factors contribute, really puts things into perspective and into context as well. So our assessments were developed around 40 years ago, and we're rooted into one of the largest and longest established research groups in the UK, really looking at the research into the impact of formative assessment on students from the ages of 3 to 19. All of Chem's work, you know, our assessments and reporting, this is all underpinned by a really strong, robust research base. It's all built on a foundation of non-commercial academic practice. And the assessments that we deliver, they're not curriculum specific, they're curriculum relevant, but not specific. So they're used by schools providing a range of different curricula in schools around the world. They really provide an external objective view of students, and that can be used alongside any curriculum your school is providing. They're also delivered on a computer, so they automatically mark themselves and are quick to do, and they're adaptive. So they use students' responses to decide whether to progress to more challenging questions or to return to easier ones. Essentially, we're assessing students right around their area of ability and providing just the right level of challenge for them. So every student gets the ability to demonstrate their true potential and remain engaged throughout the whole process. The assessments are clear indicators of where further support and interventions may be required. So they might show you that a student is particularly struggling in learning to read, such as comprehension, which can help you to put strategies in place to support that student in developing their comprehension. And once that skill has been mastered, that obviously has a knock-on effect on all of the developmental stages, which means that you would be able to improve their reading level overall. Just to flag as well, our assessments are not designed to be high stakes. So there is not a level that a student much reach. There's no pass rate for these. It's really looking into and assessing their abilities at the start of the year, their baseline abilities, and it's to help you get the most accurate picture of a student's ability in a moment in time. And for that information, you know, it's there for you, the professionals, to use in classrooms with children to ensure each of them reaches their full potential throughout their school academic career. So our assessments actually complement your use of the Cambridge pathway. If you're a Cambridge school, they can complement the Cambridge pathway, and formative assessments are available from us at every stage if this is a curricula that you're offering. Our assessments focus on uncovering student potential at each stage and assess skills rather than subject knowledge. So in Cambridge Primary, for instance, given that we've got Siobhan on the call today, we've obviously have our InCAS assessment for students aged 5 to 11. Next, we're going to give you a very brief overview of our InCAS assessment, and then I'll hand over to Siobhan to talk us through how she's used InCAS both at YK Pao School in Shanghai and her previous school in Sao Paulo. So InCAS is our assessment for ages 5 to 11. It empowers teachers to really build a strong foundation and unlock potential. So we often get told that it's a really fun and interactive assessment, and that students actually don't feel like they're being assessed. They find it's more sort of a quiz to them. It's something that they're engaged in and they want to do well in. So it looks into 6 developmental areas, and these provide a foundation for a lifetime of learning. So we assess reading, spelling, mathematics, mental arithmetic, developed ability, and finally attitudes. It may sound like a lot, but each section of the assessment just takes 10-20 minutes to complete, and that insight gives you, real insight and information that would take weeks of classroom time, and you can use that information throughout the whole year. And also, if you're using InCAS for years, it gives you that perspective as well going forwards. InCAS is flexible, so you can assess at any time of year with classes, groups, or individuals. And it is designed to be a feel-good, independent activity that learners actually enjoy, and they don't feel as though they're being assessed. And it gives you quality time to observe as the software does the work for you. And there's obviously lots of benefits. We're going to hear from Siobhan in terms of, the benefits she's seen at her school at the moment and her previous school. But the underlying and overarching theme is they really help your teaching and learning. You can see a student's strengths and weaknesses, and really find those areas that they need to develop in and help put strategies in place to help them get there. Reveal their hidden talents. What are they absolutely fantastic in that you might not necessarily have known? And how can you support them to do even better? You can also spot the support and the help that's needed. So it's really designed to complement your experience and professional judgment. It's really designed to complement that. So this information in tandem with your professional judgment and experience will help your students to achieve and really unlock their potential. So I'm now going to quickly show you a slide which, just before we move on, just to show you kind of what the assessment actually looks like for the students. So you can see there's a range of different things that we're assessing: comprehension, developed ability, and attitudes, and it's all presented in a way that is designed to be kind of friendly and engaging for the students. And there's also, before the assessment starts, there's an overview of the kind of questions that a student is going to be faced, so they get used to the sort of questions that are going to come up before they dive into that section. So I'm now going to hand over to my lovely colleague Siobhan, who's going to share with you her experience of using InCAS.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. So a little bit about YK Pao School, so the school that I'm currently principal of. We have around 620 students at the school, primarily local Chinese students, some Hong Kong, Taiwanese, Macau, and then maybe 15% international students who might be French, English, American, Italian. Similar to my other school out in Sao Paulo in Brazil, we also had a very mixed cohort, a lot of Portuguese speakers, and then some international students as well. Here at YK Pao, we are a bilingual school, so at least half of the curriculum is taught in Chinese. Interestingly, maths is also taught in Chinese. We follow the Shanghai curriculum, but our students do the InCAS maths and actually perform extremely well in it. The school had been using InCAS at least a year before I arrived. So we're now in the 5th year at this school of using InCAS. And when I arrived, I think what I found was that it wasn't particularly being used. It was very new. The school had simply done the assessment, had produced some graphs, but hadn't actually really worked out how they wanted to use the information, and I guess really seen the benefit of what they would be able to do. I had been using InCAS since 2009. I was surprised to discover the other day at my previous school in Sao Paulo. So I arrived, I guess, with a pretty clear idea of some of the good ways that we could use the data from the assessments to really benefit student learning. So as we've gone on in time, I've seen better and better use of the data. I guess primarily it falls into two different ways that we really look at the data and use it to our benefit. The first way is really looking at annual student progress by cohort and by individual and as a school as a whole. And then because we do these assessments every year, we then build the longitudinal data so we can look over time to see whether we spot any particular trends, whether things are moving. Do we see a sudden dip in students reading from year 3 to year 4? If we do, is that to do with a cohort? Is there something we can adjust? So we look at the kind of big picture of student learning and progress and map that with the data. We also then ask teachers to really look at individual student data within their classrooms, to look at each learner's profile, which you get really nicely set out in the scores chart, in the scores table, and then look at their kids. Where are their areas of strength? Where are the areas that they could perhaps be pushed a little bit more? Where are the areas that students perhaps need a little bit more intervention? So within the whole cohort, we get the data. Within a classroom, we get data. And then looking at individual students as well, we're really able to personalize information. Teachers can use that to set up perhaps small phonics groups or reading groups and so on. And I guess I would continue to stress that I think that the biggest benefit is over time. The more that you use the data, the more familiar your teachers become with it, understanding what to look for, what to recognize, finding out what they think will make a difference in their classroom, then it really becomes an extremely powerful set of information that really drives student learning and improvement. So it's been very positive. Certainly in my 4 years here at the school, we've really improved and enhanced how we use the data, and teachers are now very excited. I certainly get, it sounds pretty sad, I guess, but I get very excited when it's time for the students to do the InCAS, because I really look forward to seeing what the data will tell me about their progress for the year.
Thank you, Siobhan. That's really, really interesting. And I think moving on from that, we've got some questions to kind of delve into your experience a bit further. So I'm just going to move the slide on. So obviously you've used InCAS at YK POW and at your previous school. What do you think are its real benefits to schools?
Okay, so I think personally speaking, at both of the schools that I've used InCAS, one of the primary things we wanted to do was come away from a lot of emphasis on testing students and student scores, because you know the educational trend is towards not focusing so much on ranking and scoring. But we did understand that parents and teachers really still wanted to map student progress to be able to tell whether there was value added in a year of learning. So I think first and foremost, using the InCAS data and the assessment really allows us to see progress that students have made over a particular year. Of course, I'm always going to add the caveat that we remember that the assessment is a snapshot on a day. Children may not perform to their best selves on a particular day for whatever reason. So it's always important to triangulate any of the data that we get. But I think first and foremost, it's a great benchmarking for schools, for our students. So I think that's really useful. I think being able to get micro and macro data on students' learning. So we look at the individual, we look at the cohort, we look at the school, and we can map and identify areas of strengths and weaknesses across the whole section in that way. For example, at St. Paul's, I was able to, after 4 or 5 years of the data being collected, I was able to demonstrate in a board presentation that our students had been able to improve on an average of about 10 standardized age scores over a period of 4 years, because actually we had identified some weaknesses in their reading comprehension, and we had put some specific interventions in place, and we were able to see the year-on-year progress. So I think that's been a really huge benefit and just working out different ways. What are the areas within your school that you want to ask some questions about? What are the areas that you want to try and get some improvements in? And then looking at the data, there's such a wealth of different types of data that you're presented with, that you can just use what you need for the particular areas, perhaps getting, heads of departments, subject areas, the learning support coordinator, to use some of the data to be able to help students make progress and benefit their learning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Siobhan. So there's obviously a lot of benefits that you've seen. And what I find really interesting is that you've obviously used InCAS in 2 international schools. So with that international perspective in mind, do you think InCAS is suitable for students in international schools? And how would you say that they find the assessment?
Sure, I think that's a great question. I mean, and the answer is a firm yes. I'll at both my schools, for the overwhelming majority of our students, English is not their first language. I think we had a minority at St. Paul's, and we have a minority here who are, English is a native language for them. And I remember I went to an InCAS workshop right at the beginning, and one of the things that was really clarified for us is the kind of weighting of difficulty for native and non-native speakers of English, and there's kind of an equal weighting in terms of difficulty. The example we were given was that students who learn English as a second language often tend to learn many more formal words and structures, which are weighted into the test. And equally, students who are first language speakers tend to have more colloquialisms and more day-to-day vocabulary. So this kind of evens out for them. And certainly in practice, I've seen, I talked a little bit earlier about triangulating the data to make sure that what you're seeing of a student in the InCAS results is actually matched by what you might see in a PM benchmark, a Lexile level, and their performance in the classroom. And I have to say that across our students, native, non-native, and otherwise, there is excellent reliability, let's say, in the results that we see. I think you mentioned something about students not finding it laborious, and I think that's really true as well. The fact that it's adaptive, so if they're struggling, it's going to end sooner. But if actually they're thriving and really enjoying it, then we can see them go on and on. We have 9-year-olds who score above age 16 in their reading comprehension, and they finish the half an hour with a big smile on their face because they've really enjoyed it. And I think for us, it's been incredibly helpful. I think there is no drawback as an international school to using the InCAS assessments.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Siobhan. And that triangulation that you've mentioned, I think, is a really important point, because obviously, you have a lot of different data points that you can make connections to, and kind of it brings the whole picture to life, doesn't it? So the next question I'm going to ask is, obviously a lot of schools come to us asking kind of, when do you use InCAS and how often? So my question to you is, how often do you personally carry out InCAS in an academic year at YK POW? So we obviously get some schools who come to us and say that they want to test, twice or 3 times to get frequent results or to measure progress. What would be your suggestion to them, and how many times do you assess in an academic year?
Sure. So we've kind of landed on one. I think one is once a year is the kind of suggested guideline. There have been occasions, certainly at my previous school, St. Paul's, where we decided with our first cohort of year 2s, which was the first year that our primary school started, that we would test them on entry, and then we would test them again, do the assessments again at the end of the year. So we could try to get a measure of value added over the year. What we found that in practice is that it's pretty time consuming. As quick as each module is, it still does add up to, a minimum of, let's say, an hour and 20, or where students are able a little bit more than that. And to get children to do the assessment twice a year, we found didn't give us a huge amount of real benefit versus the perhaps skewing of the results, because kids are doing it in a shorter time frame than a year, and the kind of logistical challenges of setting it up, taking them off timetable, and so on. So initially, we used to do it at the start of the academic year, and then use the results for the rest of the year. But we've landed pretty happily. I mean, we did this at St. Paul's, and we changed it here as well, to do the assessments at the end of May, which gives us the results at the end of the academic year. So we see how students have done over the year. And it also gives us the benefit of new teachers in an academic year being able to see where students ended a good year. We know that there's always a little bit of fall back, let's say, over the long summer holidays. So when students come back, they can tend to appear quite weak. We usually notice that their reading levels have slipped back a little bit. So it's actually pretty helpful for a new teacher to know where students finished, how strong they were, or what their particular deficits were. It gives them a lot of good information as the year starts. Then they can then work out whether kids are performing in line with this or not. So we tend to do it in May.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful, particularly for those schools and kind of the delegates listening to hear when you personally would assess and kind of the reasoning behind that as well. So obviously, I think you've mentioned the wealth of information that you get from InCAS. InCAS generates a lot of feedback, information, and reports for schools to use. Bearing in mind how sometimes it can feel slightly overwhelming, which reports would you recommend schools new to InCAS should start with, and why?
Right. So definitely there is a wealth of information, and I think it's difficult really. The first year that we did InCAS, I simply sat looking through all of the data for, I don't know, I guess a month or so, trying to figure out, get my head around some of it and to work out which bits were going to be most useful for us. I think what we tend to land on is the Excel spreadsheets that give us an overview of the scores of each student across the different modules by year group or in alphabetical order. The good thing about them is you can move that data around, you can filter it if you want to see developed ability, if you want to see it by highest score or by lowest score, so all the different components. So I think that's very helpful to look at. What I also find really helpful is the individual students tables, which give us each student's particular scores in each of all of the different components. So that's also been very helpful to give us an idea of student strengths, as well as any areas they have gaps and deficits. We also use the box and whisker plots because visually they're nice to look at and they give you a lot of information about where students are above or below in your cohorts, graphic and quick and easy to look at. I think what we did and what we do is we get a group of different people to look at the different sorts of data that's available and to think about which type of data is more useful to them. I do think it takes a little bit of time to work out which of the data sets you want to work with and look at. There are endless possibilities, and I would definitely recommend if there was a workshop that people could attend which explained the different data sets, then I think that would be helpful as well. It takes a little bit of time, but then it actually becomes very easy to use the data in the way that you particularly want to at your school.
Thank you, Siobhan. That's absolutely fantastic. I've next got a question around parents. As obviously in an international school, particularly, you might get some parents asking about the assessment and why their child is taking the assessment. So how would you explain the InCAS assessment to parents and manage their queries? And also, do you share the InCAS feedback with parents at all?
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned, I think at St. Paul's, when we started using it, I would say wisely didn't let parents know that we had started using the assessment, because I think one of the key things is to make sure that the leadership of the school understands how the assessment works, the kinds of results that it produces, and has a clear idea of how they want to use and share that data. And I think if you let parents know immediately, they're going to be desperate to know how their children have done, and it can potentially be a little tricky to manage it. It may be the first year kids have no idea, the assessments may not reflect exactly what children are doing in the classroom for endless reasons. And I think you could get yourself into a situation where you have to manage parental anxiety without necessarily being fully confident yourself that you really understand what it is that you want to do with the data. So I think I would wait a year, introduce the assessment to the students, to the teachers, make sure that you have a good understanding of what you want from it, and then manage what you would share with parents. At St. Paul's, we decided that we would share basic information because a lot of the information we get is diagnostic and it's a little bit tricky to explain it all to parents. So we decided that we would give parents some benchmarks on students' reading age, on their maths level age as compared to the cohorts of a similar age. And we would give them as well some information about how their child was scoring in relation to the age standardized scores. So were they coming out in the middle? What was the top score? What was the bottom score? So we produced a letter for parents that explained the purpose of the InCAS assessments and explained their children's results for them. We also produced frequently asked questions. We kind of anticipated the sort of things they would want to know, and we sent that information. And each year we have a new cohort into the school. We send an introductory letter which explains to them why we use the assessments and what the benefits are. And then we send them, when we've done the assessment, we send them a separate sort of report letter. And in that we get the age standardized scores, and we also group for the school our students into quartiles. So they know that in each academic year, whether their child is in the 25th percentile, the 50th, 70th, or the 100th percentile. So they get this kind of information. But we do try to manage what it is we share with parents.
Thank you, Siobhan. That's that's really, really interesting to hear because that's a question that comes up time and again for us. And finally, I've got one last question. What would be your top tips for introducing InCAS to new schools who might be on this call today listening and thinking, oh, this sounds like an assessment that might be of interest to our schools? What would be your top tips to them?
I think I probably mentioned, but to encapsulate it all, I think I would start slowly. I would get the assessment. I think, I'm a huge fan, so I would absolutely recommend all schools to use InCAS, but I would start slowly. I would get a group of your leadership together, your head of maths, your head of English, perhaps your academic director, the school principal, your learning support coordinator. And I would make this the first group to wrap your heads around what it is you can do with the data. I would then have the students do the assessment, give the teachers some basic training on what the assessment entails and what could be done with it. And then actually use the first set of data to get teachers familiar, to get them to understand how it works and what sorts of information would be shared with parents and what you can do for student learning. And I think in that first year, if you kind of ease slowly into this, then I think in a second year, you're ready to be quite confident. I think your staff needs to be confident to understand, for example, that if a child doesn't get the result that is expected, that's okay. But we need to be able to understand how the data works to be able to present that to parents with confidence if they do have a query. So I think it takes a little bit of time. When I came to YK-POW, the data had just been shared with parents, all of the data that was available, so developed abilities, etc. And this led to a lot of questions and uncertainty from parents. And these were questions that teachers weren't really prepared or ready to be able to answer. So I think that's probably not a situation you want to put teachers in or the school leadership in. So my advice is go slowly, work out what it is you want from the data, get familiar with the different data sets, and then proceed from there to manage how you would share that with parents in the wider community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Siobhan. I found that absolutely fascinating and really useful, so I know our delegates will have too. Before we take some questions from the audience, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the next steps, just so the delegates know when to expect the recording from us, etc. So this will be, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you'll get your certificate of attendance sent out to you via email 1 hour after the webinar finishes. We'll also be sending a recording of this webinar and a copy of a handout, as well as the presentation over to you next week. This will come through via an email from myself at Chem. And if you are interested in finding out more about InCAS or kind of hearing more about other schools' experiences, you can visit our website, and this is at www.chem.org/InCAS. We'll also include in that email some links to some readable case studies as well, in case you want to hear more about how other schools are using InCAS too. And finally, I think that's everything covered in terms of the next steps, but just to keep an eye out on our upcoming webinars, we host a number of webinars throughout the year, and we're always looking for people to appear on them. So if you have, and also for topics as well, so if you have anything you would like to see in the next Chem webinars or the upcoming ones, just please do let us know. That's it in terms of next steps. So I'm now going to take some questions from the audience. So Siobhan, we actually have a couple here already, but very wary of time. The first question, which I think is really interesting, how, if you're in kind of a new school, if you're looking to use InCAS, how do you bring the teachers on board? Obviously, there's a lot of information. How have you done that in the past, potentially at St Paul's, but also potentially at YK Power as well?
Sure. I think you basically, you do a presentation to the staff, setting the framework. Why do we want these assessments? What benefit is it going to give teachers? What's the good stuff about using this data? And I think, we tied into a lot of the stuff you mentioned at the start of the webinar, Kate, about, personalizing, differentiating, being able to get more information on your students so you can really tweak their learning. So I think once teachers get a big picture of why, I think if you break it down for them into manageable steps, so you do not pour a ton of data on them, which is why I think this small group of leadership and middle management really needs to decide for the first year, what is it that we want to use. And I recommend starting with the basics. What is the child's reading age? Are they on age or above? We know that if they're on age, then the curriculum is doing what it should be doing. If they're not, why not? Helping us to look a little behind. So I would just make some decisions ahead of sharing with staff, and kind of sell the positives really to them. And I think honestly, once teachers see the data, it changes them. They look at their students differently, they begin to make some changes, and they really do see the benefit to their kids. One of the things I didn't mention, but that I would always do, is I would sit with teachers at the end of each year, and look at their students and how they had done, or at the beginning of a year, and look at the challenges, and then check in again with them. And this happens here at YK Power as well. And our teachers really tell us that it does make a difference, that getting this, perhaps it's a student's developed ability, perhaps it's their attitudes to learning, maybe they really have a dislike for reading, which maybe triangulates to why their reading score isn't as good. And it could be because they've struggled all along. So I think just getting a little bit more information helps teachers look at students differently. So I think if you sell this kind of benefit, I think teachers are usually pretty happy to come on board.
Thank you, Siobhan. That's such a that's a really useful tip. I think that sounds really helpful for those members of staff, and particularly they're not overwhelming them with the amount of data. I think that's something we can all take away. That's incredibly helpful. And kind of a similar question here from another delegate in terms of the students, and when they're sitting down to do the assessment, is there anything that yourself or one of your colleagues would say to them before they get started to kind of introduce them to the assessment, and how you explain kind of what they're doing and what its purpose is for?
Sure. That's a great question, actually. And I think you really just want to strike the balance between not getting the kids stressed, but reminding them that this is actually something that reflects their learning. I think the beauty of it is they cannot study for this. It makes no difference. We wouldn't know what to study anyway. So we don't get them worked up about it, but we do remind them that what we want to do is see the best that they have, everything that they know. So we tell them a little bit of how it's going to work, just in terms of, it's probably going to be 15 to 20 minutes. You just follow the instructions and the prompts. We obviously give no support whatsoever. They're done on their iPads, and the teachers are in the room with the IT support, but students have to work through. We always resist the temptation when a student says, "What does this say? I don't understand." We say, "It's whatever you've understood." So basically, we don't do more than say to parents, this is the week of the InCAS assessments. There is no studying required. Do try to make sure that your children don't miss school, and do try to make sure that they're really well rested so that they can, demonstrate the best that they have. But I think that's basically it for the kids. It's on the iPad. The modules change so they don't get stuck in doing one thing for a very, very long time. Our kids, it rolls off their backs. They sit, they do their InCAS, and they get on with it. So it really isn't difficult for the kids.
That's great to hear, and yeah, really interesting to hear how you actually explain it to them, because I think sometimes students can feel slightly overwhelmed if at something like this. So yeah, that's really great to hear. Thank you so much, Siobhan. There's a question here which potentially you might be able to answer, or at least kind of explore maybe a little, if that's okay, which is if a student's English is very poor, should the teacher translate questions in the InCAS tests? I don't know if
I
there's
would.
anything you can speak to around
Sure.
that.
So I think we've had students, but we never intervene, because I think then you defeat the purpose. If a student's English is so poor, then I would actually look at a different type of assessment. And I think that's okay as well. But I think us intervening, it actually then just manipulates, and you're not quite sure what the result is. So if the student doesn't have the language skills, perhaps you simply just need to acknowledge that, give them a different type of assessment, where you can find a different way to work out what it is you're trying to assess. But I do think having adult involvement does change the nature of the assessment. And so I personally wouldn't advise for us to do it that way. It's certainly not here at school.
That completely makes sense. Thank you so much. I think that's all, we're rapidly running out of time, so I think that's unfortunately all the questions that we have time to answer. But if there are any more questions for the delegates, please just drop me a line. I think I've shared my email address, but you also get it again when I send the when I send the recording out next week. So if there are any last minute burning questions for our delegates, please just let me know. I think that's unfortunately all we have time for today. It's been absolutely fantastic having you here on this webinar with us, Siobhan. Absolutely delighted to and fantastic to hear how you're using InCAS and how you've used it previously as well over the number of years. I think I found it really helpful, and I know our delegates have too. So I think all that I've got left to say is just thank you so much to our delegates for joining us. It's been absolutely a pleasure having you on this webinar with us today. And again, thank you so much, Siobhan, for sharing your experience of using InCAS at YK POW and at your previous school in your own words. It's always absolutely amazing to hear how our schools are actually using the assessments in those schools, and really bringing what we do to life. I think it's an absolute pleasure. So thank you to our attendees again, and keep an eye out for your certificate of attendance, which will be emailed to you in 1 hour. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you again.